Good evening, everybody. It's lovely to see so many people I recognize from previous years, but the world is moving so fast, as we've just heard from DPM. I would encourage anyone to use your app if you can, if that's the way you'd like to ask a question, or alternatively, there will be just a simple business of raising your hand. But we've got about 24 minutes, which is great, because we were worried that actually time would be squeezing on us, DPM. And I do want to encourage conversation here, even among 400 of you. It's not easy, but it can be done. And I'd like to come to the nub of what you've just been saying. You've issued an alert, an alarm call to leaders in multiple areas. You've talked about those three particular issues, but you've also said essentially that what's happening is not really understood by most leaders, and they're probably being destabilized by it, and they've got to get a grip of just how enormous this is. Right. Do you think leaders, including many in the room, really get it?
Well, we'll hear from all of you, but
not all of them.
But I do think that it is important for us to take leadership and governance seriously, because I think what has made progress, allow us to make progress over the years, is really good leadership and good governance, and the two are inseparable.
But governance, by your own analysis, is now under intense pressure in so many areas, in so many locations, in so many nations, in so many institutions, in the corporate world as well.
Absolutely. And that's why I'm pointing to some of the very negative trends that we must address, together, both as government leaders, as leaders in our corporations, and leaders in our civil society. And that the more we can work together, the better it is. Because there are challenges that each of us, each society faces. There are also many challenges that the whole world faces. And I think more than ever, the multilateral efforts at the global level is important for tackling many of these common challenges.
But I'm going to ask the same question again. Do you really think that leadership fully understands the enormity of the challenge to all they've taken for granted, which has got them politically or corporately to where they are at the moment?
I would say that in my interactions with many leaders, both across the political spectrum as well as across companies, there are varying degrees of attention to this issue. In places where the thinking is more short-term as to when is the next election coming up and what I need to do, the policies tend to be more short-term, and that can be bad for addressing this, because these are not short-term issues that you can address with a quick fix. These are issues that require a social consensus, and that is not something that you want to play with between party A and party B. These are issues that we must bring the whole of society together and say, these are serious challenges, let's address this seriously.
But do you think many are in denial about this? I could quote a lot of your speech back to you, but fraying of the social compact that holds societies together. There are some corporate and political leaders who are worried that the nature of society itself is not strong enough to endure these enormous forces tearing apart societies.
Well, I think leaders certainly need to play a very important role in this. But
are they the right leaders to do it, though? DPM?
Sorry?
Are they the right leaders to do it?
Well, I don't think you'll be right for me to judge. I think you have a room full of very wise people that you can judge this. But I would say that my call is for every one of us to do something about it, and not just sort of lament about the problem. And each and every one of us has the means to be able to do something. And I think collectively we can make a difference.
All right, let's get that discussion going. Who out there would love to come in? We've got about 20 minutes, and there are paddles and there are microphones. Let me encourage you to challenge the DPM, to agree with the DPM. Tell us what you're doing in your company, whether as a chairman or a chief executive or a member of the C-suite. They're all sitting on their hands, DPM. They want me to talk to you as if they don't want to intervene. No one. Okay, well, I'm going to give you one question which has already come in from Ken Chua, which is about one of the critical issues which you're facing here in Singapore and so many countries are facing, aging.
Right.
How can Singapore serve as a role model of a thriving, resilient economy that maximizes the potential for all our citizens? In other words, the weight a part of the social compact here, but the weight now of the aging population, how productive they can be, whether they can still work, whether they want to work, and the kind of load and anchor that can be on many economies.
Right. Well, in many of my discussions with our seniors in Singapore, I'm very encouraged that, in fact, many of them want to continue working. They want to make a contribution. And I think the way we think about the life cycle will have to be very different. In fact, quite a few people have given me this book called Living to 100. You know, and if lifespan is going to go up to 100, not just in Singapore, but globally, then the way we think about education work will have to change. The cycle where we just start off with education, we start work, and then we retire and enjoy ourselves, I think that cycle is no longer the valid paradigm. We have to think about multiple cycles of work learned, and that our whole education, we have to think about lifelong learning, where we learn to learn, unlearn, and relearn new things, and take on new roles and new responsibilities. And I've seen that in many people, certainly many of the corporate leaders have adopted that. And the other thing which we specifically have been doing is to extend our retirement age and re-employment age. And I'm very glad that both our workers as well as our companies have been very positive about this trend, that there are ways in which we can make the full use of the expertise and experience of our seniors. And if our seniors are willing to be retrained and relearned, it's actually a very positive force in our society. And also, by the way, I spent some time in Japan looking at what Japan was doing. And one very positive thing that the Japanese are doing is that the seniors stay very active. And the staying active at work or in some social circle is not just about making money. It is also about having the whole social network and the whole support network, that you can interact with people, you can continue to have friends, you can continue to have a life.
Marcel Smits, which countries are best at approaching the three challenges you outlined and would recommend as countries for Singapore to emulate, but can I also put other countries to emulate as well, who are wrestling with each of those three in ways which really are hacking away at the very structure of society's politics and corporate life at times?
Well, I think different societies are tackling this in many different ways. I had discussions with the leadership in China on what they are doing with an aging population, and they are looking at this quite seriously. Japan, whom I'm familiar because I just went there a few months back to understand what they were doing. They're also doing quite a lot of work. In the case of Europe, I think I've read about what the Scandinavian countries are doing, but I don't know as much. I'll be happy to learn more about what is being done. But what is common, though, is that I do think we have to think about investment and savings much more thoughtfully.
But you're a finance minister as well as being DPM. When you sit around the table with other finance ministers in various different fora,
Right.
do you believe that they are gripping the enormity, the tax overhang, for example, the pension overhang that you've talked about, the expectations of the public, which therefore, if they don't get it right, depending on where the revenue comes from, will create the kind of societal backlash that you've been pretty graphic at highlighting in your speech?
Well, some are quite serious about it, yeah. But I would not go down to naming names because I want to be friends with all.
But the overall approach, let's not maybe talk about nations, but the fact is, do you think that there is a level of denial that certain things, if you like, coming down the track are simply not going to be as difficult as they appear to be, judging by your analysis tonight?
Well, I think there's a lot of scope for us to discuss this in greater depth because as I mentioned early on, I think the governance and leadership will be key to resolving many of these challenges, and that we should catalyze a deeper understanding across the world on these challenges that we're facing. Because, for instance, the issue of aging is not just an issue facing Singapore or another country in Asia. It's an issue that affects many, many countries. And if I may add, it's not just an issue of aging, it's also a whole issue of the demographic transitions. If you look at the population profiles across the world, what you're likely to see is that in many advanced developed economies, the population is aging and sometimes shrinking. But the populations of the emerging economies are youthful and rising. And the question is, I raised one subject about the allocation of capital. Rather than the savings in the advanced economy being invested in projects which yield little or no returns, it is far better for us to think of ways which we can channel these savings to catalyze productive investments in many of these emerging economies, and that many of these economies that have a youthful population need to focus a lot of effort on education, because you either have a population dividends or you have a lost generation. And the reason is this: with Industry 4.0, many jobs will be reshaped by technology in significant ways. So the question is whether are our young people equipped to be the programmers of the robot, the inventors of the robots, or are they going to be replaced by the robots? And these are serious questions that have to be asked throughout the world.
Who would like to come in? Thomas Olson, where are you sitting, please? Can I get you a microphone? Because where are you? Please, Thomas, I'll come to you in a moment. Please, paddle number 7, microphone number 7. That's the way of getting my attention through here. Thomas, on governance.
Sure. I just wrote in a question about what needs to change to make it easier or enable leaders, both business and political, to take those long-term choices when they're by and large evaluated by short-term metrics.
Well, that is a very good question. I don't know whether, maybe I should do a quick survey. Many of you are corporate leaders. How many of you would do away with quarterly reporting?
Be bold.
Wow.
Your shareholders are not watching. Hang on, put those hands up. Let's try the other way, DPM. How many are determined to remain attached to a quarterly reporting? No one, 2.
Oh,
now that's important. So a lot of people are waiting to be persuaded.
No, I thought a lot of leaders are hoping that we do away with quarterly reporting.
Indeed.
Yeah. So indeed, I mean,
but not everyone.
Not everyone. Yeah. Maybe we should ask Axel for his reason why he thinks that we should continue quarterly reporting. Is there a mic?
Microphone, please, at the front, number 5. Yep. Do come in. Axel, please.
Quarterly reporting doesn't stop you having long-term views. If you're convinced what was right for the company, you need to do it independent of quarterly reporting. Quarterly reporting requires you to be very transparent and communicate that, but it's not a reason not to have long-term orientation. I think that's been mixed up for the wrong case.
Yes.
And let me put to you, long-term, what do you mean by long-term? What do we mean by long-term? What is long-term? So much is happening so quickly. Look at what happened in Saudi Arabia just a few days ago, and the expectations that, well, probably that wouldn't happen, but now it has happened. Long-term is much shorter these days, right. And you've got to be flexible and you've got to be agile.
Yeah. No, yeah, but let me say that I would, the views on this matter, and I've spoken to many of the CEOs of companies and the chairmen of board, and the views on this matter is quite divided. There are quite a lot of people who feel that quarterly reporting has made the planning a lot more short-term, has made companies a lot more short-term. But there are also a lot of people who feel that, well, you have to stand by your conviction and you have to go out and persuade people. So I would say that, short of massive changes in electoral systems around the world, I think what is important is for us, in positions of leadership, to go out and persuade people that this is for the good of our people in the long term. Now, so for instance, I have announced unpopular policies, and I'm prepared to stand by that because I think it's important for us to have the conviction to do what is right. And I would say that I mentioned about our investment returns, and that just 50% of it now is the largest source of revenue, larger than any other source, larger than the corporate taxes that we collect. And why? Because I think I'm glad that our founding leaders had the guts to do what is right, and our people supported them. So we are very grateful for that, and I hope that we must continue with this compact.
All right. Anyone else want to come in? Jacob Topso, where are you, please? Who's got a hand up? You are in the, yes, please. Microphone number 9, please. Anyone else want to come in? We've got about 10 minutes and another microphone here, please. Number 3. Please, Jacob. Microphone, please. No, could you give him the microphone? Thank you.
It was really
free.
difficult to get
You
that
don't have-
microphone.
you
Maybe
don't
she
have to pay
doesn't
for
want
it.
me to ask the question. Thanks for a wonderful keynote address, extremely relevant. I have a question on inequality, as you mentioned, as one of the big challenges that we have. Many say that addressing inequality issues comes at the expense of growth. And without growth, obviously, there's less wealth to distribute. Do you agree with this? And if so, how do you see possibilities to balance inequality and growth? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a very good question. I would say that as corporate leaders, and many of you are corporate leaders here, there are many things that you can do. I mentioned in my speech about the need for every company to transform your operations. You need to be more innovative, more technologically savvy, and you need to look into new markets and new sources. But what is it that companies can do to bring the workers along? Now, in Singapore, we have tried to do this effort where the restructuring of the economy and the redesign of jobs and retraining of workers can come together. So as a company restructures its operation, introduces new machines, jobs need to be redesigned, and at the same time, workers need to be retrained to take on new jobs. So just last week, I visited a number of companies on the work that they were doing there, and I thought they were doing a great job. And I know that many companies in Singapore are embarking on that. So that's one. And two, there are also many companies in Singapore that decided that they would like to take part in creating a more platform solutions for many of the small, medium enterprises. And the tech companies in particular can play a very important role here. Because it's not possible for SME to try and hire a whole team of digital programmers to go and do a specific software for them. I think what is more practical is something which they can plug and play, and which can be developed at scale and just scaled across many different industries. So we have to try these different ways of doing it, but I would say that companies can play a very important role, and in doing that, you are actually safeguarding your long-term interests. Because if you get the kind of backlash against globalization, against big companies, then I think we'll end up with a very messy situation.
What do you mean by a backlash? What do you
Well, when people feel that
find that
there
as?
is no future, that I would rather be on the streets than to go and go for training, go for work.
But you seem to be suggesting that we haven't seen anything yet when it comes to this which you've called a backlash potentially, a societal backlash, where the middle class potentially could be hollowed out by much of what is happening on jobs, on skills,
Right.
on ability to earn, and the ability not to actually reskill.
Yes. Well, part of it is that I mentioned about, in particular, the rise of the digital economy. And one characteristic of the digital economy is that the marginal cost of serving the next customer is close to zero. Everything else is profit. And the more globalized you are, and in fact, the digital technology allows you to capture a global market very quickly, the more profits you make, and therefore you are seeing that the network effects of this digital economy and the increasing returns to scale is making a lot of changes a lot harder. But if we want to have the benefit of this globalization, and we want to have the benefit of Industry 4.0, it is critically important that we undertake this task of enhancing the social compact now before the problem gets bigger. And the problem will only get bigger because the way in which technology is advancing, the way in which globalization is advancing, you're beginning to see the pushback. The Doha round has been launched for many years now, and we have made little progress.
Certainly in our project, we've talked about not populism, but pushbackism.
Yes.
That there's pushback
Yes.
in many, many areas, whether it be investors, whether it be voters.
Yes.
Let's go to there, paddle 3, please. Anyone else?
Good evening. This is Bosco from Hong Kong, who runs a social enterprise called We Do Global, which connects
Right.
people from different ethnic backgrounds. And I would like to ask, as you have mentioned, the world is getting more complex, it can bring us more challenges, but at the same time, it can also bring us more opportunities for young people. So do you think entrepreneurship or social entrepreneurship and innovation play important roles? So if so, how would you encourage entrepreneurship and innovation for the young people in Singapore? So thank you.
In other words, DPM, how can they thrive on change? In other words, not be intimidated and overwhelmed, but actually see this as a commercial and a societal advantage.
Well, I'm very happy to hear you mentioning that, because in fact, in Singapore, we have an increasing number of social enterprises, and the young people have been taking up, very many of these courses. Just 2 months back, I was with a group of young people in my constituency, and they were doing a whole range of very interesting things because they wanted to make a difference. There was one young team that decided to produce something called ugly food. And ugly food was about, he said, well, we must reduce food waste. And the bananas, the apples and all that may look bad, but actually they are not bad. And how do you process it in ways to make a very nice drink or a nice a dessert out of it? And they were doing very good work. So I think it will be very good for us to promote this. So how are we doing it? Well, we have a number of youth organizations that are doing a lot of this under our Ministry of Community, Culture and Sports and Youth. The Minister Grace Fu has been doing quite a lot of work to promote. In fact, I just had a discussion with her just a few days ago about what more we can do in this area. So the National Youth Council, we also had a youth call where young people who want to do something before they, after they finish school or before they go to universities, can take part in a youth call for them to do more work.
Thank you, Jacob.
That's been good, yeah.
Please, microphone. Sorry, I thought the microphone had come to you.
Yeah.
Please, number 5.
Thank you, Jacob Frankel. Thank you very much for these very eloquent remarks. You made a very convincing case for capital to move from the industrial countries to the emerging economies that have so much of a potential. Now, this presumes that the roads are open between the two groups, that there is a concept of openness, that trade is valued by somebody, and by the same token, at the very same time, we see that the world at the present is going in opposite direction. The question is the mechanism by which we bring about this, because we are all passengers on a big airplane where the two co-pilots do not get along with each other.
Are the engines still functioning?
Well, the issue is, how do we really deal with it, except for sitting on our hands and waiting for the best? Because we need to have a mechanism to, we know where the center of gravity of the problem is. Everyone in the corridor said that the greatest danger was the slippery slope of the protectionism, and yet we need to move resources from one part of the world to the other. Thank you.
Thank you, DPM.
Well, Jacob, thank you. Well, I would take, I suppose, an approach that a small economy like Singapore will need to take, which is that if the big tankers are not moving, the smaller, smaller speedboats can hopefully move a little faster, and you're welcome to join us on the smaller speedboat. So let me mention a couple of things that we have been doing. You're absolutely right that while the idea of moving capital from developed economies to emerging economy is a right prescription, the reality is that countries are at different levels of willingness to welcome investments, to welcome foreign capital. They are at different stages of this development. So what we seek to do is to work with like-minded countries with similar views. So for instance, in the case of Singapore, we have signed free trade agreements with many countries, which then provide for, among other things, besides the trade in goods and services, also for investment protection with bilateral investment treaties and including even the avoidance of double taxation. And that has been a great help. Now, one other thing which we recognize is that for many parts of the emerging world to grow, you need infrastructure. And so the Chinese Belt and Road Project is one effort at this, but there are many others. Japan has a lot of resources on this. The US, OPEC, is also working on this. But the key is to make sure the infrastructure projects are properly structured. And that is why we started this Infrastructure Asia. The aim is to bring demand and supply side together. On the demand side, working together with the World Bank, World Bank has an urban development hub in Singapore, and they provide a lot of training to officials on how you can work on infrastructure projects and plan infrastructure projects properly. And on the supply side, you have a whole range of players, banks, and so on, with a lot of capital. But capital, the only way that infrastructure can be done properly is to crowd in private capital. So the World Bank is prepared to provide seed capital for this, the IFC, MIGA, and now increasingly ADB, AIB, and so on. So all these are valuable ways for us to do it. And the key is to do it well so that the projects yield proper returns, both either economically or socially. And so we have to think hard about ways to grow. And the other thing which I feel strongly, which I mentioned in my speech, is that it's very important to combine hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure. Because if you just build an industrial park, it's not going to have big impact unless you also train workers for the work, unless you also have a system of rules, a set of rules that say, I protect investment, I value your investment, I'm not going to change the rules of the game midway if the company is making money. And so creating that legal structure is important. I'll just add one last thing, that we are very, I spoke a few weeks back, we have a UN convention on mediation that is named after Singapore, called the Singapore Convention. And it makes mediation of disputes, particularly commercial disputes, a viable solution. And in the case of infrastructure projects, for example, it is very important, particularly in the Asian context, to maintain good relations. And in order to do that, mediation is usually a far better way than the sharper ways of just going to a court. But if parties need to go to a court, we have two other mechanisms, which is Singapore arbitrations, where people can come together and conduct arbitrations. And we also have an Singapore International Commercial Court, where the Supreme Court can hear cases which do not involve even the Singapore party. So if two parties in two different countries decide that both agree to come to the Singapore court for mediations, the court can make a judgment and they can agree on that. And our Chief Justice, in the midst of discussing with many Chief Justices around the world on how we can make this, create an enforcement mechanism for this.
DPM, we've run out of time, but there's one question I've just caught about the climate emergency. Are you prepared on the climate emergency?
Climate
Can I just
emergency, yes.
quickly from Peter Woodward,
Yes.
is Singapore's growth model and planning fit to meet the crisis in the climate emergency? And we are sitting here at a time of enormous haze from one of your neighboring countries.
Well, that is not quite climate emergency has been...
But it affects the climate.
It affects the climate,
Yeah.
it affects, and my environment minister has been discussing, with our neighbors in our region, and I know that President Jokowi himself has called for, meetings on this, and...
But you emphasize the climate emergency in your speech.
No, but in the case of the climate change, I'm referring to something even bigger, right? The rising sea level, and as global temperature rises, the rising sea level will be an issue. So my Prime Minister has, in a recent National Day speech in August, spoke about what we are going to do. The rough estimate today is that it will cost us $100 billion at least to get the climate mitigation measures done. And I have personally gone to the Netherlands to study what the Dutch are doing. Because the Dutch has an interesting saying that God created the earth, the Dutch built Holland. Because so much of the Dutch, of the Netherlands is really below water. But they have been very creative in dealing with this. And in fact, we have a project now ongoing to build polders. And we are experimenting with this. So as the Prime Minister has said, our estimate is that it will cost at least $100 billion. But we are looking at, if how climate change will affect sea levels and how quickly we need to do. But if we start now, we have a chance of doing something within 100 years. Or at least within 50 years if we need to accelerate the work. But if we do nothing about it, then we are never able to do anything. So hence the emphasis in my speech about thinking long term. It's not going to be easy to set aside $1 billion to deal with this every year for the next 100 years, but if it is existential, we ought to invest.
And that means a new model for growth here, or a modified model?
Well, not quite, because I have told many businesses that I welcome you to set up and expand your business in Singapore. I hope that you make a lot of profits. And they looked at me and say, why? I said, the more money you make, the more taxes I collect. And the less I have to worry about welfare payments and the likes. So the interests of businesses and the interests of governments cannot be divergent. We all hope to have good businesses. We all hope to create good jobs for our workers. We all hope to prosper. And we should work together.
DPM, thank you very much indeed. We've overstayed the time, but
Yes.
I think that's been appreciated, enormously appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.